welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is part 3 of the breakthroughs, and this is obviously the most crucial part of the 3. It's basically where what appears to break down, um, and it is the critical moment of the interrogation. Just to recap, the first breakthrough, where Watts voluntarily admitted to the affair, took place at about 16:07, so around about 7 minutes into that session, and that was after the polygraph. The second breakthrough was Watts admitting to his father that he killed Shanann and that his children were both dead. This took place about 36 minutes later after that first admission, from around about 16:43 onwards. But the real breakthrough was the third, when after confessing over a span of 11 minutes, the agent's worst fears were realized, and Ronnie started advising his son to get a lawyer. The amazing thing is that this was actually brought up. It was brought to Chris Watts' attention, and even so, the interrogators were able to sort of sidestep it, dodge it, and get what they still needed to get. As soon as Ronnie started talking about getting a lawyer, the agent scrambled. It was within around about 10 seconds of Ronnie telling his son, well, you got to get a lawyer, let's see what we can do, and I could arrange. That's when the door opened, and the agents were back in the room. In fact, as Ronnie uttered the word arrange, Chris Watts actually lifted his head slightly and looked at his father as if he was starting to consider that option or that alternative. And just then the door opened, and then Watts tilted his head down. It was in that precise moment that Watts stood to gain years of a potential life sentence. So he may have been sentenced to 10 years, maybe 20, maybe a sentence with the possibility of parole. He could even have conceivably, unlikely, but conceivably been acquitted of murder under certain circumstances. But the point is, as soon as he dropped his head down, in that moment he basically lost everything. He lost his life. He lost the dream that he was going for, and his life actually changed in that moment. Lee barged in first, but she was careful to ask permission. So even though she sort of stormed into the room, she actually sort of asked Ronnie if it was okay, and Ronnie reluctantly accepted the intrusion, saying, "Come on in." This was a fatal mistake by Watts' father. He could have said, "Give us a minute." I mean, it was a critical time that Agent Lee was stepping into the room, and there was no reason why Watts' father couldn't have said, can you give us some time? In fact, when the interrogators left the room, they actually said to Watts, "We'll give you as much time as you need," and up until this point, only 11 minutes had gone by. Now, if you consider how long the interrogation was, over 5 hours that day and 4 hours the previous day, this was 11 minutes when the interrogators interrupted. So they would have been completely it would have been completely reasonable for Watts or his father to say, "Well, that's been 10 minutes. Can you give us a little bit more time?" Right? But instead, Ronnie let them in, being reasonable, and Lee advanced into the room, and she reached out to Watts. At this time, when she entered, Ronnie had his hand on Watts's left arm, um, or shoulder, and then Lee placed her hand on Watts's right shoulder. It's important to stress that this was really the first time um, Agent Lee had really been this, uh, I don't want to say intimate, but this close to Watts and this warm towards him and this almost empathetic um, in the entire interview. And we may look at it and say, well, she was just doing a job or whatever it was, but it's much further than that. By doing this, Lee immediately broke the connection between the father and the son. For the first time, she leaned over and rubbed his back, but brought her face quite close to his face, and almost as if she was trying to get him to sort of look at her and notice her and notice that she was there. But again, this may not seem like a big deal, but consider the facts. Watts has just admitted murdering his wife, his pregnant wife. Lee then enters, a woman, and comforts a man she's likely repulsed by, and perhaps even afraid of, but she can't show it, so she has to hold her nerve and keep Watts in the game and on their side. So she enters and she pretends to feel for him and pretends to want to comfort him and be there for him when she clearly doesn't feel that way. In fact, what's actually going on is she is desperate to break the little sort of connection between the father and the son and then get Watts to talk to her. That's sort of what that's all about. But this is the part that's very easy to miss because of the drama of this particular moment. This is the part that's easy to miss. If Ronnie had said, look, we're going to get a lawyer, or if Watts had called it, if the interrogation had stopped at this point, Watts would have had the advantage. Now, one might say, well, how could he? He'd confessed. But his confession would likely not be admissible in court, and that's what matters. Why not? Because most of it's barely audible. I mean, even the media, when the media want to sort of sensationalize this aspect, there's very little that they can use because so little is audible. In fact, when Watts is talking about, when Ronnie is talking about the lawyer, it's very, very hard to make out what his father is saying. And when his father is interviewed on his own, most of that interview is sort of garbled because one can't tell what Ronnie is saying. He's got sort of a drawl. So the confession, even though it was recorded, would likely not be admissible as evidence. Also, since no law enforcement officer was in the room, even if the audio was admitted as evidence, Watts and his father could agree between themselves that certain words captured on the audio, they could dispute them, and they could say, well, that wasn't what they actually said to one another. The point is, the confession wouldn't stand alone at that point. And what is amazing is, after he confessed to his father, came this opportunity, this sort of voice of reason from his own father, maybe we should get a lawyer. And Watts started responding to it and then stopped. And we'll get to why Watts wasn't necessarily stupid in terms of that decision. He was certainly not a genius in that decision, but there was a method to his madness, and we'll get to that in a second. Let's be clear, though, that the confession was a giant leap forward in terms of the investigation. So this was a massive breakthrough, because for the first time he just admitted first-hand knowledge that 3 members of his family were dead. So He didn't admit one or two, all three of them, and that was from um, a perspective from law enforcement where they had no idea where they were, what had happened to them. So that was a giant leap. Um, so as I said, the confession at this point was legally worthless, but in terms of the investigators who heard it themselves, it was the jackpot. What Lee and Coder needed to do from this point was get what's on the record, and do so gently and do so reasonably, and just keep him talking and keep him comfortable. They needed him to forget about getting a lawyer and get back to talking to them, while playing the delicate game with what's his father still in the room. So they had to reassure him as well. So that's quite an important distinction to make, is that when they re-entered the room, they knew what they wanted to do. They needed to get what's on the record, but now they've got his father in the room as well, who is already jittery. Within 11 minutes he's like, let's get a lawyer. And so it's not just Lee and Coder. It's quite a complicated situation. It's not Lee and Coder just entering the room and getting Watch to talk to them. They've got to make sure they don't, what they say and how firm they are doesn't upset the father, who doesn't have any of the sort of pressure. And of course his son telling him that he murdered his wife, that is pressure, and probably wrong-footed him to some extent. But the point is that the law enforcement have a delicate tightrope to walk here, and they do it really well. When Lee sits down, she sits directly beside Watts. She sort of ignores Ronnie, her elbows almost touching Watts' arm. Coder sort of sneaks in around the back or around the side and sits down silently in the corner, doesn't say anything. And then immediately Lee asks Watts the vital question. In a sort of a kind, soft voice, she says to him, "Will you tell us what you told your dad?" It sounds like a very simple question, but it would have profound consequences. So this is really the critical moment. It was up to Watts to decide here, yes or no. And incredibly, he did as he was asked. If they'd asked Ronnie to step out of the room at this point, perhaps Watts would have had a moment to regain his composure. And perhaps even without his father in the room, he may have felt the wall return, that sort of inner wall that he sort of had up against other people. Maybe if his father left the room and they wanted to know what he told his father, that maybe the wall would have just gone up again and he would have balked. But with his father's hand on his one shoulder and Lee staring at him and Cody in the room, he sort of had three people waiting for him to say something. What was he going to say? Was he going to say, "No, I'm not going to tell you"? In theory, then they could ask his father, what did he say, right? So Watts probably felt like he had no choice. He did have a choice, but he felt like he had no choice. Had he said no at this point, as I've stressed, the defense could have had a field day with this case. I'm not going to go into that here. I'm not going to go into the potential defense that he could have had, but there was quite a lot that they could have argued. Incredibly, just because Lee asked him nicely and treated him, this is now a self-confessed murderer, with warmth, he did what he thought was reasonable under those circumstances, reasonable for him and reasonable in terms of them. So he lied about Shanann killing the children, but he admitted the lesser evil in his mind of killing Shanann. What he was describing was a kind of involuntary justifiable homicide. Shanann killed the children, and so I was upset and I killed her. I snapped. So it's not necessarily first degree murder, etc., etc. And there are cases where these crimes are given a lesser sentence. Um, in any event, if in his story he'd claimed he'd at least tried to rescue the children, just in terms of the story, if he'd said yes, he'd tried to rescue the children from Shanann, he tried to pull them away, he tried to give them CPR. Obviously, there would be virtually no way of proving this, and it would just simply be his word. But the fact that he claimed he didn't try to rescue them, this counted against him. If he said that he did, this could actually have saved him. It could have saved years of his life. We actually saw this happen in the Oscar Pistorius trial, where Oscar said that he performed CPR on the victim, that he'd shot 4 times, and also he said that I think he actually performed CPR on his girlfriend's body, even though she was dead. He sort of made a bit of a spectacle, appearing to try and save her. Now, a lot of the people on the scene were fooled by this. When I researched the case, when I looked at the autopsy images, you could clearly see the bullet that went through her head, and this is black talon ammunition. So as soon as it entered the skull and entered the head, the fragments would splinter off, and then would basically I don't want to go into graphic detail, but Reeva likely died instantly. So the notion that, in other words, this shrapnel would have sort of scissored through her brain tissue, but the point is she would have died instantly, and there would have been no recourse. And so the notion that Oscar would have performed CPR is absolutely ridiculous. But it's without seeing the brain tissue, and without seeing the wound. And obviously in court often they don't allow that kind of graphic material to be seen by the media, and in any event, Oscar succeeded in convincing everyone that he helped Reeve, or he tried to save her, which I don't believe. But the point is, this convinced the judge, and she mentioned this. And in Chris Watts' case, the same thing could have happened. He could have simply just said he tried to save his children from Shanann. He tried to grab them away. He tried to perform CPR. But Chris Watts had obviously not thought about it this far. And I just want to deal with the other aspect, which is about the reluctance to ask for a lawyer, right? To us sitting on the outside, we may think this is idiotic, and it is, but there is a method to this, and we've seen it in a couple of cases. Amanda Knox is one of them. Amanda Knox and also her boyfriend were offered consulate help and told to get a lawyer, and both of them didn't. And you can sort of see the thinking, you can see the psychology is, if I ask for a lawyer, it means I need a lawyer. If I ask for a lawyer, it means I need to defend myself. If I ask for a lawyer, I admit that that my behavior is suspicious, or I'm aware that I'm in trouble, right? So that definitely is a part of the psychology. The same applies to Jodi Arias, I believe, and others. In any event, in a recent episode of Homicide Hunter, a guilty suspect was sitting in a lounge when the police came in with a search warrant and searched his home, and a detective sat down next to the suspect. And you sort of see in an interview later on where the suspect explains his reluctance to ask for a lawyer, where he says he preferred to let the cops search his home because the other option was worse. The other option being, if you hire a lawyer, you look guilty, and then the police sort of pay even more attention to you. But interestingly, when the suspect did eventually ask for a lawyer, the detective said, well, he's totally within his rights to ask for a lawyer, and then once that happens, the detective can't pursue any further questions. He can't get a version. One of the aspects where a defense lawyer would advise a client is don't say anything, and the reason being, if you start giving different versions and they contradict themselves, it doesn't play out well in court. Whereas a defense lawyer can provide one version and it's sort of concise and it's not contradictory, and that's really the reason, is that you don't have lots of different versions and fine-tuning and so on. In any event, this whole thing where you're not going to get a lawyer is about appearances, and appearances can be deceptive. Of course, in a situation like this, if you don't hire a lawyer and you're guilty, you can get yourself into a world of trouble and end up looking even worse, and that's exactly what happened. We know now that Watts had also lied to his father here, telling him he'd only killed Shanann. So at this stage, he thought he had the upper hand. He thought he'd fooled his father. He thought he was fooling the investigators. And when Agent Lee soothed him, rubbing his back, it maybe reinforced this notion that wow, she was feeling sorry for him. He had her in his pocket, right? So it's possibly for that reason that he decided to stick to his game plan, because pinning the crime on Shanann may have seemed like a better idea than getting a lawyer. Pinning the crime on Shanann was like, well, she's guilty, so why do I need a lawyer? I know, I don't have anything to worry about. No one here is worried about me. It's Shanann. And if his focus is on pinning the crime on Shanann, then maybe he can get that right, and maybe he doesn't need a lawyer. Big mistake. Watts' brain was so scrambled by now, he forgot that whatever the details, he had just admitted to committing murder to his father, and now he was about to do the same with the two agents on the record. He may have figured admitting to Shannon's murder wasn't a big deal. After all, when he admitted it, everyone understood. His father understood, and hell, he understood why he'd done it, and it seemed as though Coda and Lee understood. But this was an act. This was appearances can be deceiving. He'd made a very crucial error, and when someone lies, you've got to keep track of those lies. And I think Watts was losing track of his lies, and losing track of what appearances were saying what. What's also underestimated was that if he could fool them with appearances, the agents could do the same to him, and they did.
She almost just let me told her or confirm with the other side.
I didn't tell her how long, she just knew. She just knew. I could deny all I want, she just knew. She was hoping we'd go to counseling or something. I didn't like my counseling.
She lost it. And the separation. Did she pack up the affair that morning too? Separation.
Pretty much knowing the affair was going on, but we just profusely denying it.
You did. I made a total bunch of more of us knew something was going on. She actually killed both her children. And you snapped.
What's that? You okay? You sure? Chris, help us work through this with you, okay? Will you tell us what you told your dad?
After that conversation,
Water up quick, son.
no, you're fine.
Yeah.
After that conversation we had, and she accused me of the affair, she, in her heart, she knew what was going on. And she knew about the dinner the other night. It was too much for just me.
She knew about what now?
When I told her I went to a Rockies game, I
Oh.
went out to bed. I went downstairs.
And that's when you told her about the separation.
Well, that was when I was upstairs in bed. And told her, what I wanted, and they called it a separation. And that's what I want.
I have enough to run.
I went downstairs and started packing up. have a few things. I heard a couple things upstairs, but I didn't think anything of it. I continued to just, own thing and get ready to get everything packed up.
Next.
I went upstairs and I was going to talk to her again. And I saw on the monitor, Bella's covers were like pulled off and she was just laying there. She was just hot. Cycled over to see she was in there with her on top of her. Choking her. Freaked out. I ran in there and got on top of her.
What'd you do?
She blue.